And of course, even if we are still in lockdown and still do distance learning, we will switch to English in order to deal with our today's topic. And this topic is automated testing. And today we want to focus on the very basics, on the basics of unit testing. So my first question to you is, why automated testing in general and why unit testing? My goal is to find out what you already know about unit testing and about automated testing in general. So why? Why is automated testing important? Exactly. It's super boring. You are perfectly right. As a developer, you don't want to retest everything if you change a minor detail of your code. It's super embarrassing if you add some features to a software, and by adding some features to the software, you are breaking some existing functionality. End users do not tolerate that. That is called a regression error. And that is something that we try to avoid. And automated tests can help us avoid that. A small little nice robot sitting on our shoulder is helping us and continuously testing our code. So whenever we change something, this nice little robot detects that we have broken something and tells us exactly that. So we can make sure that there are no regressions, or we can minimize the number of regressions. That is one aspect of automated testing. What else? Very good. You say, as a human, it's hard to place a certain load on a website. So as a single tester, I cannot run 1,000 simultaneous connections and simulate 1,000 active users at the same time. You are perfectly right. You are mentioning a special kind of test, which is called a load test. This is not a unit test, but it's a load test. There are specific generators which you can rent in the cloud, or you can also install software in your local area network. And these software components, they generate load. They are the so-called load generators. A very prominent one is, for instance, JMeter. JMeter is used very frequently for exactly that. So with that, we can automatically test a certain load on our software, and we can make sure that the software still works even if we have a lot of users who perform a lot of tasks at the same time, simultaneously. Correct, very good, thank you very much. What else? Especially if you think of mobile development and browser development, you have to keep in mind that your software will run on a variety of different devices, operating system, screens, screen sizes, screen orientations, and other things. So therefore, it is pretty boring if you do manual testing to do exactly the same testing, for instance, on Android, on iOS, on various versions of Android, on various browser types, on various screen sizes, and so on and so on. If you automate your tests, you can run your automated test suite on all these different platforms, and you can, for instance, find out if some algorithm is broken on Safari but works on Firefox or Chrome. So therefore, it makes sense to automate things, especially in the context of end-user software which runs on smart client devices like browsers or mobile phones. If you are building just an application which runs just on a specific version of Windows or a specific version of macOS, maybe you are even shipping the hardware to the customer. Imagine that you build a certain kind of machinery, a machine doing some mechanical work, for instance, and you ship the industrial PC together with the machine, so you have very tight control over the hardware that is installed, over the screen sizes, over the touch screen, over the operating system, and so on. Then you might not have the problem that you have to test with a wide variety of end-user devices. But in real life, this is rather the exception, not the rule. The rule is that many of your users have many different devices, and so automated testing can help you cover all these different flavors of end-user devices. That's another reason why automated testing is really important. What else? Okay, I see. Okay, so you say if you automate a test, then the test will work exactly in the same way every time you execute the test suite. Well, that is a two-sided sword. Why is that a two-sided sword? Because on the one hand side, that's good. Imagine a situation where you have a contract with a customer and you have defined clear so-called acceptance criteria. Your software has to produce a certain output if you have a certain input. And this input and output is part of your contract. Then it is important that you have automated tests in order to ensure that you fulfill the contract. That would be, I think, what you meant with consistently execute the same tests and do not forget certain test cases every time you do the testing. That is true. But on the other hand, it wouldn't work for testing workflows, and it would not work so well for user interfaces, for instance. Because the problem is how to find the correct acceptance criteria. If you do so-called explorative testing, where users sit in front of the computer and behave like users, they do unpredictable things. They explore the software, clicking wildly around in the software. Such testers are also very, very useful because they do not execute the same test over and over again, but they execute different tests every time they approach the software. And especially for user interfaces. For user interfaces that offer a large degree of freedom for the end user, such explorational tests are super important because end users are very creative when it comes to using your software. So they might come up with behaviors that you would never have thought of. So therefore, executing always the same tests works very good in a highly predictive environment. So if you have, for instance, a mathematical business logic where you exactly know that if you pass in the input 1 and 1, the result must be 2, for instance, by adding these two numbers, then that is perfectly fine for a test suite covering all these acceptance criteria. But if you have a user interface, maybe a software for graphical design or a drawing software, something like this, then it might be useful to not just have automated tests, but also to invite real-life users who perform real-life work with your software and consider that a kind of explorative testing. They explore the software and they find new bugs simply by using it with clicking around. Okay, so thank you. Very good point. But now we have discussed advantages and disadvantages. Does anybody else have additional comments on why automated testing is important? Now the next question, before we start writing code. Why not automated testing? If it's so obvious, if it has so many advantages, this automated testing stuff, why would you be hesitant? What is the reason that you would not write automated tests? Any ideas? Oh yes, Florian, you're absolutely right. It takes a lot of time. Writing automated tests is writing software. And as you all know, it takes time to simply write software. So therefore, creating automated tests takes some time. It takes effort, and in practice, it also costs money. And you have to think about whether it's worthwhile. For instance, if you write poor tests which do not really test cases which happen in real life. Or maybe you only have poor acceptance criteria. So you calculate something, but in real life that is not that doesn't have real relevance, then you might waste time by creating unit tests which do not test the things which are relevant for your end users. Another possibility, especially if you think of user interfaces, is that you create tests which are very shaky. So sometimes they work, but sometimes they fail. If you have a test which fails 50% of the time, you will probably ignore these failed tests after a few days because you don't like to check why the test failed yesterday. Sometimes it works, sometimes it fails. At a certain piece of time, you simply ignore the failing tests. And therefore, it doesn't make any sense to write this test in the first place. Because if you don't check the outcome of the tests, why bother running the tests at all? So writing the correct tests is super important. It's just like with real software. Listen closely, that is important. If you build high quality software and no end user cares about it because you built a functionality which nobody really uses, then you wasted your time. The same is true for tests. If you write the test which does not test a practically relevant scenario, you wasted your time. It's not good if you have lots and lots of tests. It's only good if these tests are really relevant. Correct. They take a lot of time creating them. But with automated tests, there is a second thing to it. You have to maintain them. If you create automated tests and you change the underlying software, for instance, you change your class structure, your inheritance structure, you rename and restructure functions, for instance, you always have to maintain the unit tests too. So for every change in the software, you have to do an additional change, at least one additional change in the unit tests. And that is time consuming. And you have to think about whether it makes sense. Does it make sense to write the unit test that you currently are writing, the automated test? It doesn't need to be a unit test. It might also be a performance test or a scalability test or a user interface test. So does it make sense to automate this test at all? Sometimes it's simply more worthwhile to do explorational tests, to ask users to test your software, maybe to establish a kind of beta program where you take your software and give it to friendly users and they tell you back what's working and what's not working. You have to think about what it takes to build the test cases, to automate the test cases, and to maintain the test cases compared to doing testing done by humans. Okay? Correct. Anything else, why not writing automated tests? Executing automated tests takes quite a long time. Don't underestimate that. If you create automated tests, especially if they are so-called integration tests, where you test the database together with the web server, together with the client software and so on, also known as end-to-end tests, if you take those tests, running them takes quite a while because you have to automate creating the database, setting up the web server, creating the environment for the end user, then automate all this stuff, let it run through. It takes a while. So you have to think about, when you have tests automated, how often do I execute these tests? Is it often enough or is it too often? Because if you run it too often, it will slow down your development process. If you run it not often enough, you have tests, but they will not tell you that something is going wrong in the right amount of time. So thinking about the runtime costs and the time it takes to run these unit or integration tests is something that you have to keep in mind. So these are the reasons why, as developers, we should consider writing automated tests and the things that we have to keep in mind when we think about whether it makes sense to write automated tests. Now I have a guess for you. What do you think in practice? I've seen a lot of customers over the years, really a lot of customers. What do you think in practice? Do practical teams out in the wild write automated tests? Or is this something which is pure theory and nobody does it except in school or university? What do you think? Is automated testing a thing? Yes, it is, definitely. The good teams, teams that write stable software, software which is used by a lot of customers, teams that have a certain maturity level in their software development, they write automated tests. Definitely. It is a real big thing. And writing automated tests is not a trivial task. So if a team is capable of automating tests on a high maturity level, you can bet that these are very good software developers. Next question from practice. Who do you think writes the test? Does the developer who writes a certain piece of business logic write the test for the business logic? Or is the test written by a different guy or girl? Do they have specific testing teams who write the tests while the development teams write the business logic? Think about the following scenario. Maybe after this year you found your own company, your own software company, and you have to think about how do we organize writing tests? Who would you put in charge for writing the tests? How would you organize the creation of automated tests? What do you think? Okay, so your argument is if the developer who wrote the business logic also writes the test, then this developer has a certain bias, or maybe the developer is not destructive enough. He doesn't want to find the mistakes because he would find or she would find mistakes in the code that she has just written. That could be, that could really be an argument. However, think of the following situation. You are the developer writing the code now, and you know exactly how this code works. Do you really think that somebody else is so deep in your code that it is easy for her or him to come up with meaningful unit tests? Somewhat hard, won't you think? So your guess was perfectly correct, especially when it comes to integration tests, where you test the integration of multiple components like user interface and a web server, a web API, or a web application and a database. If it comes to integration tests and you want to test certain integration scenarios, and if it comes to end-to-end tests where you automate the user interface and you simulate the flow of the user through the application, then you are perfectly right. This requires a certain special knowledge that not every developer has. And additionally, it's very important that you approach these tests unbiased. You called it biased, and I like this word here. Or you approach this test not from a technical point of view, but from a user's point of view. Are the business processes properly designed? Are they properly implemented? So writing those tests is often a task for specialists who specialize in automated testing and who specialize in integration testing. And in many cases, this is not implemented by the application developers. However, if we think about unit tests, where you just test a single unit in your application, this might be a single function, this might be a single class, so a very technical entity. For those unit tests, it makes sense that the developers who are really writing the logic will also write the unit tests. So there is not a correct answer for all situations. In some situations, it makes perfect sense to distribute writing the tests and writing the code between different teams or different team members. But for some other rather technical tests, unit tests, it makes sense that the same developer writes the test as the developer who is writing the business logic. So in real life, I might sit down, write a certain function, and then I ask myself, this was a non-trivial algorithm. Maybe I have written let's say, a recursive algorithm, and as the developer I need to test this recursive function, for instance, then it absolutely makes sense that I, as the developer, sit down and write the unit tests for this recursive function in order to find out whether my own code works or not. See? So these very small tests, unit tests are they called, they are typically implemented by the developers themselves. The other tests, in a small team, the developers might also write the integration tests and end-to-end tests. In a larger team, in a larger enterprise, you might have special developers or even special testing teams. Now this is what I wanted to tell you about unit and automation testing in general. Do you have any questions regarding that topic before we start diving into the code?